So today's webinar highlights some of the current research around monitoring and controlling invasive species in the Great Lakes. Our panelists are Harvey Bootsma, Associate Dean and Professor from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's School of Freshwater Sciences, Janice Gilbert, the Executive Director of the Invasive Phragmites Control Center in Ontario, Sara, Professor of Genetics and Genomics at the University of Winnipeg, and Steve Pothoven, the fishery biologist from NOAA GLERL, Lake Michigan Field Station in Michigan. So we're so excited for everything to get started. I want to remind everyone this event is part of a quarterly water symposium series sponsored by the Freshwater Collaborative, the Great Lakes Higher Education Consortium, and the Council of the Great Lakes Region. These events seek to encourage and advance collaborations, share science across borders, encourage students in research and career opportunities, and present research that is solving real-world problems. And we all came here because we really want to know what sea lamprey, zebra, and quagga mussels, round goby, and Phragmites all have in common. So let's get started. So if we could hear from all of our panelists, let's see, what are we looking for? If you could introduce yourself, your area of expertise, and include your location around the Great Lakes. Let's start with Steve.
Yes, I'm Steve Pothoven, and I'm a fishery biologist with NOAA, and I'm at our field station on Lake Michigan in Muskegon, Michigan. And my area of research is primarily the lower food web, so we've done a lot of work with the invertebrate invasive species, and then also early life history of fish. And so we tie the invasive species work back to fish recruitment and those types of issues.
Thank you. And Janice?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. If you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen because I thought it'd be easier to show you what I do as opposed to just talk about it. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. Yeah, so I'm a wetland ecologist by trade. I spent a lot of time on the Great Lakes coastal wetlands, assessing them for many years. And back in 2005, I was assessing coastal wetland on Lake Erie, and I came across this absolute disaster of Phragmites, and that's what really got my attention and sparked alarm bells for me, because I had not been hearing about a problem with Phragmites on the Great Lakes. I had been hearing about it on the eastern seaboard, but not on the Great Lakes. And so that's what started my journey. And so I've learned quite a bit since that time. And there's been a lot of great initiatives as well since that time. I formed this control center to help people deal with Phragmites in a responsible manner. A lot of the areas where Phragmites is growing, the species at risk habitat, it's really sensitive areas. And I just wanted to help promote doing the control work in a responsible manner. The other thing is, just to help guide the control efforts, create plans, and help people learn more about the plant, and also to actually undertake the work. And as you know, a lot of these invasive plants don't just grow in isolation. There's others that grow with them. So doing this a little bit more efficiently. So at our center, we offer a lot of services. One that I'm really excited about is the research and development piece of it, because I'm always looking to how we improve things, working off the science. We work all over the province, a lot of time on the Lake Huron, but we actually work inland as well, and we go up into the northern regions. But one of the research R&D developed was getting these trucksters from Sweden. I learned about this when I was first investigating what they were doing with reed beds in Europe, where Phragmites is native and still grows monoculture. And they use these machines in the winter to clear out the dead stuff so it'll grow nice. They want to promote its growth. So I'm thinking, okay, let's reverse that and use it to get rid of it. And so I developed this cutting to drown program. It's been exceedingly successful. And we work with a lot of community groups. That's another piece that's really important, because if you don't have the local community engagement, we can come in at Calvary and get rid of the big stuff. But once we're gone, we need the local people to take over. And along with the cutting to drown, the mechanical, we also have the herbicide piece. And just looking to put less product in the water, and so developed this wicking machine on one of our trucksters that we could wick the herbicide on the habitat aqua instead of broadcast spraying in these lower density areas. And so we've been working on a number of sites for a number of years, cutting to drown and using the herbicide and just cleaning up these shoreline areas. Been exceedingly successful over the years. The one research we're working on now, I'm so excited about, is use of spray drones. I think this is going to be a game changer for us to get in these areas where we can't use traditional methods, or it's not responsible to take in track vehicles or amphibious vehicles, whatever, or we can't physically get in. And just finished a 3-year project using the product Habitat Aqua with the spray drone. Really, really exciting. I think this technology has the capability for us to actually eradicate it in a lot of our coastal wetlands. So I just wanted to point that out. We're just starting another 3-year program with the Bear product Vision Max as well. So with that, I'm just going to end sharing my screen here with you.
Thanks. Harvey, if you could go next.
Hi, I'm Harvey Bootsma. I'm a professor here at the School of Freshwater Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, just across Lake Michigan from Steve Pothoven on the other side of the lake there. I work on the Great Lakes, primarily Lake Michigan, doing work on biogeochemistry, so nutrient cycling, and also algal ecology, which has kind of what got me into invasive species. When I first started here 25 years ago, I started working on the nuisance algae problem in Lake Michigan and the other Great Lakes. And that kind of led us to dry-scented mussels, realizing the important role that they were playing in the nuisance algae problem. So that got me into mussels. And from there, we also started looking at round goby and other invasive species and what role they were playing in the food web in Lake Michigan. So that's kind of the work I do on Lake Michigan. And then in my spare time, I also work on the African Great Lakes, which have had their own challenges with regard to invasive species. Somewhat different than what we see here in Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes, but in some ways similar as well.
Great. And Sara. Oops, you're muted, Sara.
I'd like to share a few slides as well. So I'm Sara Good. I'm professor at University of Winnipeg in Manitoba, of course not in the Great Lakes per se, though I did grow up actually in Kingston, right at the frontier between Canada and the United States. But I'm working with the Great Lake Fisheries Commission, primarily people at Hammond Bay Biological Station, as well as a bunch of collaborators in both the United States and Canada, working on invasive sea lamprey in Upper Great Lakes. So I think most of you, everyone here knows this, but the sea lampreys became invasive in the Upper Great Lakes, reaching to the Upper Great Lakes in maybe the 1930s, led to collapse of the fisheries by the 1960s. So there's only about 2% of the catch of some freshwater species like lake trout after the invasion of sea lamprey. So historically, the sea lamprey are anadromous, and they're spending their parasitic. They have a complex life cycle, of course, and they spend their parasitic feeding phase ancestrally feeding on species in the ocean, such as sharks and rays. But once they gained access through the opening of shipping canals for boats into the Upper Great Lakes, first began parasitizing freshwater species such as trout, salmon, whitefish, many other high-priced freshwater fisheries. And whereas they don't typically kill the hosts in which they were sort of evolved to work with, in the Upper Great Lakes, when they parasitize a trout or something, very high likelihood of killing the animals. And so this led to the emergence of an organization called the Great Lake Fisheries Commission, which I imagine all of you are familiar with. It's a binational organization with governmental and researchers from Canada and the United States working towards conservation of the freshwater species. And they've used a combination of larval lampricides sprayed about every 3 years on freshwater streams where the lamprey larvae grow, as well as barriers, as shown here, barriers which stop the migrating adults from reaching their spawning grounds. And these are largely effective. They're leading to about a 90% reduction in populations of sea lamprey in the upper Great Lakes, but they are costly and have some off-target effects. Recently, sort of relevant for what I'm focusing on, it's also been intermittent work where they release sterile males, which are chemically sterilized, and in some freshwater streams, so at the spawning sites, these sterile males are released, and as long as there's more of the sterile males than wild males, this has also been shown to reduce the success. But due to the expense and some off-target effects, the Great Lake Fisheries Commission is now considering genetic control options, and that's kind of where I come in. I am a geneticist and conservation geneticist, and although the mystery to sea lamprey sex determination is still unknown, we discovered that chromosomes that are contained only in germ cells, so the ones that will make the sperm or the eggs, seem to be essential for male fertility. So I could talk about some of this later if people are interested, but basically we found a variety of genes that could potentially be good targets to think of for genetic control. And then think a little bit about the partnerships for this work. To develop CRISPR-Cas9 has been piloted by quite a few labs and appears to be quite successful in sea lamprey. So there's consideration of developing a target that could alter sex ratios or create sterile individuals. I've been working with Wei-Ming Lee, who works for the Great Lake Fisheries Commission and is PDF at Michigan State University. I'm also working with other researchers at Hammond Bay Biological Station. This is really essential for our work because they're developing approaches for aquaculture, rearing of sea lamprey. So this could be both a source for things to do CRISPR and also allow us to test potential target genes. And also more on the basic research side, I have some colleagues in Europe, Dr. Rüdiger Schroes and Jan Bogart, who are world experts in male and female signaling pathways in zebrafish. And I've collaborated with them on previous research, and I'm talking with them about trying to identify what could be good targets. That's my...
Thank you so much. Okay, now moving on to the next question. Who are the primary agencies and organizations involved in invasive species policy and research in your state or province? And how do you and your office or your organization interact with them? So let's start with Harvey.
Well, within Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources is the primary agency that oversees management of invasive species. But of course, when you're talking about the Great Lakes, one state or provincial agency can't do something like that alone because they cross borders among states and between Canada and the US. So there's also federal agencies involved. Most of the work that we do is not directly related, the work we do here at the university is not directly related to management per se, although I'll talk a little bit later about some efforts we're making to move in that direction with regard to Dreissenid mussel control. Most of our work is research to understand the impacts of invasive species once they are in the system. Especially now, again, on Lake Michigan, mostly Dreissenids and round gobies and some other invasives. And a lot of that research is done with support from and at times in collaboration with federal agencies such as the Environmental Protection Agency. We work with the National Park Service. We also work with the NOAA Great Lakes Lab, which is where Steve is from. And then Great Lakes Fishery Commission. And then, getting back to work at the national level, we don't work with the Coast Guard, but the Coast Guard does play a role in invasive species control, primarily through regulating ballast water treatment of ships coming into the Great Lakes and ships moving between the Great Lakes. So they're another important player. Not so much involved in research, but more in implementation of regulations.
How about you, Janice? What are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. Well, in Ontario, a lot of our policies around invasives comes from the provincial government. But as Harvey mentioned, for the Great Lakes, it has to be binational. So certainly the federal government is involved as well. Climate Change Canada, particularly with fish, and the zebra mussels and those invasives, the carp, Asian carp. But we do have in the province with the province, they do support some groups like the Invasive Species Center up in Sault Ste. Marie, who's involved in a lot of invasives in Canada. So that's and the Canadian Council on Invasive Species as well. So those are two organizations that are coast to coast to coast. And then in Ontario itself, we have an Ontario Invasive Plant Council. And one of the other hats I wear is with the Ontario Phragmites Working Group. And this was an organization that was formed back in 2010 to help promote efficient and effective and environmentally responsible use control of Phragmites. And so what's really neat with, and I'm frag-centric because that's my work these days, but what's really neat about that is how the universities, the research that are doing feed into improving our practices, our knowledge base of how to approach the control aspects. And I'll mention one, Dr. Rebecca Rooney at University of Waterloo. But with the biocontrols that were started by Bernd Blossie's lab at Cornell, as you know, with biocontrol, these beetles don't, or the moss, for instance, with the frag don't respect the political boundaries. So University of Toronto has taken that and had a lot of research on release for the biocontrol for Phragmites in Ontario. So that's been really exciting and helpful. And then we have a lot of large organizations, Nature Conservancy of Canada, Ducks Unlimited Canada, and others who are leading the charge as well with invasive plant management.
Thanks. And Steve.
For the part of NOAA that I'm a part of, we're basically a research agency or a research group, so we don't really work with policy that much. But a lot of the partners that we work with for research are the same as the ones that Harvey brought up. Some other ones that we work with, in addition to the universities, we have really close ties with a lot of different universities that broaden our scope and make a lot of this research possible. And then because we work with that interface between the lower food web and fish ecology, we do a lot of work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then also with the United States Geological Service, which is part of the Department of Interior, and they have a fisheries lab on the Great Lakes. And so we do a lot of work with them. And then one more aspect would be with various tribal groups. Most of these the tribes have biologists and a vested interest in invasive species research. And so we do a lot of work in conjunction with the tribal groups as well.
Oh my goodness, I was muted. Hi, Sara. No, you're up next. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess my story here is a little similar to Steve's because I'm focused on the research side of it, a little bit less aware of the public control programs. But the research that we're doing through work at the Hammond Bay Biological Station involves a variety of different collaborative grants between researchers, both at Canadian and American universities. And then independently through the sea lamprey community, essentially, other of these collaborations are fostered. The sea lamprey aquaculture procurement project that I'm part of at Hammond Bay Biological Station has also been integral to sort of establishing both a source of lamprey that can be used to test different ideas about how they could be controlled in the upper Great Lakes. And with this organization, we're also working with some of the tribal agencies across the United States and Canada who have developed similar procurement plans for the Pacific lamprey, which is an endangered species. Yeah, I think those are the main things I have to say.
Okay, next we want to hear about success stories. Are there places in the world that we can learn from? So what are your success stories or the success stories? That's what we're looking for next. Janice, why don't you start?
Thank you. Well, when it comes to Phragmites, fortunately, we've had a number of success stories, and I qualify that as, the significant reduction of Phragmites and then a minimal effort required to maintain these areas frag-free. Don't consider a site eradicated for 3 years post seeing any frag at a site. So we've had some great success in achieving that on a site-by-site basis. And certainly on Lake Huron and Lake Erie, where there's been a lot of concerted effort, there's really good outcomes coming from the work. And I'm expecting more as there's a provincial program being rolled out through the Invasive Species Center and Nature Conservancy, significantly funded through the province of Ontario, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, in the tune of 11 million for the next 3 years. And so really exciting news that there's going to be more of these puzzle pieces plugged in across the province. So I'd say that. I'd also say it's really interesting I like to look at where the plant is native and see how it's behaving there and what they're doing to manage the plant if they need to. And I mentioned with the Phragmites using the truxers and watching how they were restoring the reed beds because they were trying to maintain a healthy Phragmites. And I think for me, that's how I can learn to to take what they're doing to promote its growth and use it against the plant. So that's kind of a neat switch on things. But there's so much technology going on in the world. There's so much new things coming on board that I'm really excited about for like the eDNA, being able to take a sample of water and figure out what's in the, like, all that is, to me, is going to be a real game changer for us in terms of trying to track the spread of invasive species in the Great Lakes and also get on that early detection rapid response program.
And Steve?
Yes, I would say one of the success stories probably over the last 20 years are the efforts to control new species coming in and through ballast water. I've been here for 27 years, and at the beginning of that time period, it really seemed like you could make a career just looking for new invasive species. And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. So it seems like a lot of those efforts to control new species through ballast water are successful. It's not something that you could make a career out of now, just looking for the new invasive species, as easy as it was, say 20 years ago when I first started this. So I would say that's a real success story.
Great. And Sara?
I guess from personal point of view, the biggest success I can think of is on this SLAP project that I was mentioning. So traditionally, people have had a hard time working with sea lamprey because they have such a long life history, but also around 3 months of gestation, they entirely use up the yolk, which the early embryo was using, and then they switch to purely exogenous feeding. And this has always been a difficult period to rear them in the lab. But together with people that have been working on Pacific lamprey and the staff at Hammond Bay, we've recently been able to rear larval sea lamprey and not only past that 3 month, but we have some animals now which are in their 3rd year, and they're looking at potentially metamorphosizing in the lab. So this has been the first time this has happened in sea lamprey, and it offers opportunities, to do things, to try things such as chemical agents that may, constrain the reproduction or um, or viability of the larvae, but also allows us to pursue things like CRISPR to test some of these knockouts in animals that at an older age, because sex determination occurs around 2 years. So were we to pilot one of the genes, say that we're interested in, we would have had the problem before that we couldn't raise them to 2 to see whether it's having an effect on fertility. But now the aquaculture rearing of sea lamprey is going well.
And Harvey.
Well, like Steve said, the ballast water regulations have made quite a noticeable difference in the influx of invasive species to the Great Lakes. And it's kind of an interesting story. It's still an ongoing story because, there's a little bit of disagreement between Canada and the US now, because Canada is trying to impose fairly strict ballast water treatment rules within the Great Lakes, not just for ships traveling between salt water in the Great Lakes, and requiring ships of below a certain age to have treatment systems on board. And there's some debate about what the deadline for that should be. And that's primarily for controlling movement of species from lake to lake within the Great Lakes. But overall, that program has been quite successful. Also, there's been the Asian carp barrier on the Illinois River, which has, at least up until now, as far as we know, been successful at keeping Asian carp from getting into the Great Lakes. And hopefully it stays that way. It's been expensive, and there's still efforts to improve that, but it's held them off so far. Another, what you could say is a partial success story, is in the control of Dreissenid mussels, zebra mussels and quagga mussels. The discovery of chemicals that are specifically target those organisms. One in particular is Equinox, is actually a product that's the toxin that's produced by bacteria. A fellow named Dan Malloy spent years looking for microbes that would produce toxins that specifically targeted Dreissenids. He almost gave up, but in the end, he actually did find something, and it's produced commercially now as Equinox. And it has had some success in some areas. It's not the best solution for the Great Lakes, because it would just be logistically impractical and really expensive to apply it to a whole Great Lake. But it has had some success on smaller systems. And then, I mean, Sara can speak more to this, but the sea lamprey, they're looking at new methods, but I think it's fair to say that the sea lamprey program has to a large degree been a success. The control program, the application of lampricide, it's an ongoing thing, so it'll never get rid of them, but it certainly has reduced them to numbers where they're not nearly having the impact on the Great Lakes that they were back in the mid-1900s when they wiped out lake trout populations. But that's an ongoing thing. And we've seen that recently, where the numbers have jumped up a little bit in the last couple of years, because Canada and the US weren't as able during the COVID years to get people out to treat the rivers. And we're seeing a bit of a rebound from that right now, which shows the importance of that program. I'll throw another kind of anecdote out there, and this is from the African Great Lakes. And it's kind of taboo to raise this topic now. It's controlling one invasive species with another invasive species, or an introduced species. A huge problem on Lake Victoria for many years was water hyacinth, which is a South American plant, but it was introduced to Africa. And it exploded on Lake Victoria and essentially shut the lake down for about a decade. No ships could get out from shore. Fishermen couldn't get out because the lake was just packed with water hyacinth. And the solution to that problem was the introduction of a weevil from South America that specifically targets water hyacinth, which, used to be a relatively common solution 100 years ago until we discovered that often you were making problems worse by introducing one species to control another. But actually, in the case of Lake Victoria, it does appear to have been a success. There's been no major negative impacts of introducing the weevil, and it's had a strong positive impact in that it really knocked down the water hyacinth in that lake. So that's just kind of an interesting story from another system. And then I guess maybe a success story that we're still working on is over the last decade, we've started working at small scale levels of removing zebra and quagga mussels from Lake Michigan. And we'll never do it at a whole lake scale. What we're trying to see is if we can do it at scales that are large enough to be locally significant to the ecosystem. So that's included experiments where we've applied Zequinox, and then experiments where we've just gotten down with divers for a whole summer and removed mussels. And more recently, doing some large-scale tarp experiments where we put barriers on the lake bottom to kill the mussels. And we've had some success with that at a local scale, and we're now working with several federal agencies to see if we can scale that up to environmentally relevant scales.
Thanks. That's terrific. Okay, so it can't all be good news. So now we want to talk about some things that are causing negative impacts. So when it comes to invasive species, what do you see as causing the greatest negative impact on the Great Lakes ecosystem? What do you see as the biggest impediments to preventing and removing invasive species in the Great Lakes? And let's hear from Janice first.
Thank you. I was just thinking on the last question with the purple loosestrife, the beetle release program has been a real success. I forgot about that one. But anyway, yeah, so from my perspective, of course, I'm frag-centric, so Phragmites certainly has a huge impact on the nearshore, has an impact on a number of species, particularly those that rely on our coastal wetlands for all or part of their life cycle. So that's a really big threat, certainly for the nearshore. But I think in general for the Great Lakes, like at least that plant doesn't move, it's rooted, so we have a fighting chance. It's those plants and animals that are moving around that is like once they're in our those waters, like unless there's some kind of check and balance in the system other than humans, we're in trouble. So those Asian carp, that really is a concern to me. If they ever get in, we are so, the Great Lakes are going to be an absolute disaster. And you think about what the zebra and quagga mussels have done to the Great Lakes. It's really changed. And I don't think we have any Great Lake now that has any looks like it used to pre-shipping. Like they've all been changed so much from species that are coming from elsewhere. So it's really changed the dynamic of the Great Lakes. And I say the Great Lakes aren't as great as they used to be. They're in a lot of trouble and they do need our help in many ways. And the thing that really irritates me is these new emerging plants from the horticultural trade or pet trade from aquariums. People don't know any different and they dump them in the water, right? The water soldiers and some of the hydrilla and whatnot, or they're transporting them from lake to lake on their boats. And those are, to me, very easy fixes. It's about education, getting programs in, stopping the selling of those plants for backyard ponds or aquariums, or at least putting some tight restrictions on that. And I know with the Asian carp, there was a really big program from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans that would go to the fish markets in Toronto and try to find live carp that were brought in from elsewhere for communities. And so they shut that down, so they don't inadvertently get released out into our lakes and rivers to invade. So, there's still a lot that needs to happen. And certainly it comes down to people, like our practices, what we do, what we dump into the Great Lakes or our rivers or creeks without really knowing that we're causing an issue. So there has to be a lot more awareness in that and a lot more constraints and what we allow to bring into our country that could be released, that could be a harm.
Thanks. Steve, what are your thoughts?
I would say, at least during the course of my career and working on the Great Lakes, that the zebra and more so the quagga mussels had one of the greatest negative impacts on the lakes, just because of how it interacts with the whole lake. It affects the nutrient cycles, which would be the very base of the food web, but it also affects the plankton and the zooplankton and the invertebrates in the lake and all the way up to the fish. So it's sort of in the middle of the food web in a way where it affects things above and below it in the food web. So it has a really outsized effect for what you would think a small mussel on the bottom of the lake would have. One of the things that's really interesting about mussels and invasive species is when I first started in the lakes, we were looking at how whitefish eating mussels was negatively affecting the whitefish, just because mussels weren't as nutritious as other food. Now, 25 years later, one of the things that we're looking at is how alewife eating mussel larvae is affecting the survival of larval alewife, which is an interesting thing to be concerned about because alewife themselves are an invasive species. But they're a really interesting invasive species because some people really like them because they support salmon and trout fisheries in the lakes. But at the same side, they're a very powerful invasive species that have had real negative effects on zooplankton, and they have real negative effects on other fisheries that people really like, such as yellow perch. So it's come to the effect where we look at the effect of mussels on something like alewife and how that affects a fishery for non-native salmon in the lake. So it's a very complex system, but I would say mussels have had like a huge overriding effect during the course of my career.
Thanks. And now Sara.
I guess I speak most directly to sea lamprey, which I'm most familiar with, but of course they've had a huge negative impact. And like Harvey was saying, in many ways, the control of the sea lamprey with barriers and this lampricide TFM that's applied to freshwater streams, they are really a truly great success story. But there is ongoing management issues, as Harvey also mentioned, under COVID with the inability to spray, the populations came back. So this underscores the importance of keeping those levels low. And currently, the barriers which block upstream migrants from reaching the spawning sites are in need of repair. And there are concerns about the long-term non-target effects of TFM. Thankfully, sea lamprey don't spawn in every single, like most of the streams. They spawn in a small proportion of the streams within the Upper Great Lakes tributary system. Thankfully, I say, because they spray this TFM every 3 years, which is about the cycle for the larvae, for larval recruitment. But nevertheless, even though there are not toxic effects on many of the other freshwater species, there are known species such as lake sturgeon, trout, and some other species are sensitive to TFM. So with this long-term application, it's not clear what the effects on them will be. So although it's a success story, it's something that needs continual investment of money and perspective with respect to other effects. And it's for this reason that there's more interest in looking at genetic control options, but those are going to come with a whole suite of other actual concerns about potential deleterious effects of say using something such as a gene drive. Yeah, that's sort of a whole other discussion.
Thanks, Sara. And Harvey.
Well, I'd have to agree with Steve that, well, I guess it depends on the timescales you're looking at. Certainly prior to the 1990s, and especially if you go back to the mid-1900s, sea lamprey was probably the biggest invasive species impacting the Great Lakes. But in the last few decades, it's really been Dreissenid mussels, first the zebra mussels and the quagga mussels. And Steve already pointed out the reasons for that. They just they affect the system in so many ways. They're what we call a keystone species. We have quite a few invasive species in the Great Lakes that haven't really done that much to the Great Lakes, but then there's a few that have had huge impacts, which we refer to as keystone species. They just, the quagga mussels and zebra mussels found a niche of a benthic filter feeder that really wasn't occupied in the Great Lakes, so that allowed them to explode. So we're still trying to understand their impact and figure out whether we can control them to any degree. I guess I'd just add on to that, some of the invasive fish species, especially the round goby. But you're asking about negative impacts, and in some ways the round goby has a negative impact. It displaces other fish, especially in the nearshore zone. It eats the eggs of other fish. But it's interesting because the round goby also serves as food for other fish. In some parts of the Great Lakes, smallmouth bass are going gangbusters because they've got this new food source of round gobies. In Lake Erie, the Lake Erie water snake, a subspecies that was threatened, has made a comeback because they're finding lots of food with the round goby. And I mentioned the mussel removal experiments that we've been conducting. One thing that surprised us with those experiments is that after removing quagga mussels, in some places it's been 8 years now since we removed quagga mussels, and they've hardly returned at all. And we're pretty sure that's because round gobies are eating the small mussels as they try to colonize that substrate. So in some way, we're kind of fighting fire with fire here, in that one invasive species is helping to control another invasive species. Also, the round goby, I mean, it dominates the nearshore system now as far as fish go in Lake Michigan and some of the other Great Lakes. And it's one of the few fish that actually can feed on quagga mussels and zebra mussels. And it's becoming a more popular prey item in some of the upper trophic level fish, such as lake trout. So there again, round gobies are playing what you might call a positive role, in that they're able to sequester some of that energy that's being scavenged by benthic algae and by mussels in the nearshore zone, and get that food energy back into the food web where it's available to higher trophic levels. So when we look at invasive species, we tend to see them all as negative, and often they are. But some of them can play a positive role. And I think also, at least with some species, like dracenids and round gobies, we're at the point where we may be trying to control them a little bit, but I think what we're doing more is figuring out, okay, how does the new system work with these species, and how do we manage the system now that it's a completely different system? So, kind of if you can't beat them, then, well, let's see what we can do with them. Not that we should completely give up on trying to control them in some areas, but where we know we can't, then we just got to figure out, how do we manage the new system?
Thanks. Knowing that we have about 15 minutes left, I'd love, we have a couple questions just for Janice, so I'm just going to go for it. If Phragmites is being used in Europe, can you tell us how? And then the second question is, I'm interested in hearing more about the cutting rigs you showed on your slides. Where can I find more information about them? Do you think that they would be useful in cutting invasive cattail?
Oh, yeah. So to answer the first question, in Europe, where Phragmites is a native plant, as I mentioned, it still grows monoculture, so it still does pose some issues for humans for access to the water, to recreate and whatnot. But humans have evolved with this plant, as has wildlife, and so basically, with the uses for reed beds are a number. They'll go in and harvest the plants in the winter, and they'll use it for thatching because the stalks don't break down, so they'll put them up on roofs for thatching, or they'll make these large windrows for wildlife to utilize. And they will also graze their animals in the reed beds along the coastline in France and whatnot. So They use them kind of as a forage food. I don't recommend any of that in the systems I'm working in. Just want to get rid of the plant. Yeah, and the machines I was referring to, they're called Truxors. I think there's a company in Michigan now, or somebody in Michigan, they contacted me a few years ago. They have them. But you can Google them. They're an amphibious machine used for really good for cutting Phragmites or removing other like milfoil, whatnot. Not so much cattail because of for cattail, what we do with frag is we cut the stalks below the water to drown the plants, and you can't do that with cattail. It's just too thick of a stalk, and many times it's on a floating mat anyway, so that won't work, unfortunately. But yeah.
Thanks. Okay, now we have a question about collaboration. So I'm going to combine a bunch of things because of our limited time. So in what ways have international collaborations improved the outlook? And where are there opportunities for additional partnership and collaborations? We also have a question from an attendee regarding collaborations. What do the panelists think of the value of collaborating with tribal governments and First Nations to monitor, control, and collaborate on invasive species programs? And then if you could also include additional research that's needed, and how could academic institutions as collaborators help that? So let's start with Sara.
Yeah, it's actually essential, something in the work that we're doing. And I've only been working on this really intensely for 6 years. The collaboration is essential between academics, tribal nations, as well as government agencies, the U.S. Geological Survey. All of this is really essential. A lot of the things that we do require phenomenal amounts of expertise and knowledge in very distinct camps that takes decades for any individual to accrue, and collaboration is really essential. I see that in what I'm working on because there's been a lot of interest in having some mechanism to modify fertility or reproduction in lampreys, but it's really taken us 3 or 4 years with some students dedicated to it to make any inroads into this like difficult question. And then, for the development of something like CRISPR, again, it does take labs 3 or 4 years to at least 3 or 4 years to be able to get that up and running in their laboratory. And then combine that with all the work in the aquaculture being done at HBBS, it's a lot of work by the staff there. So just the project that I'm involved in really takes at least, it takes expertise among different collaborating groups to make any inroads within a realistic timescale.
Super. Next, Harvey. And Harvey, you have a couple of questions specific to your work in the chat as well. So not to overload you, but let's see. Do you think that the various negative impacts of round gobies outweighs any positive impacts is one? And we've got UWM vessel has used a towing mechanism to remove or crush quagga mussels on the bottom, and you've also killed them off by suffocation with a tarp. Do you have any follow-up on how quickly or slowly the mussels repopulate that area? I know we're running out of time, so I wanted, if you can work that into your answer, that'd be amazing and magical. Okay.
Okay. I'll try to squeeze in what I can. As far as international collaboration, we've already talked about ballast water regulation, and I think that obviously takes international collaboration. Also, a lot of the research we have done has been in collaboration with other universities, especially I think of University of Waterloo, that has done a lot of work on Lake Ontario and Lake Erie that parallels the work that we've been doing in Lake Michigan. And we learn a lot by comparing research on different lakes. Collaboration with tribal agencies. We haven't done much of that in the past, but currently we are looking at doing that with our work with the National Park Service up in northeastern Lake Michigan, working with the Grand Traverse Band. Because what we're looking at there is how will mussel removal potentially affect things like lake whitefish spawning success. And that's where we need to be working with the local band. What I've found in the past is that if you talk to fishermen, whether it's sport fishermen or especially commercial fishermen, they know a lot about the lake that we as scientists don't know. They're just out there a lot more than we are. And so it's really valuable collaborating with the tribes and other commercial fishers that get out there a lot, and really, have a good sense for what's happening in the system. And then somebody asked a question about, our mussel removal stuff. So I mentioned the nearshore work that we started 8-9 years ago. We're still following up on that. And like I said, it's been surprising how slow the mussels have been to recolonize. So obviously somebody has seen our mussel masher experiment that we're doing in offshore waters where we can't dive, towing basically a big heavy device to crush mussels. We just started that 2 years ago, and so we're continuing monitoring that over the next couple of years in collaboration with NOAA Great Lakes Lab to see if gobies are doing the same thing out there that they are in the near shore, i.e. are they preventing the recolonization of mussels in that area? And I guess I would say that, our research, we've come a long way in understanding how invasive species, especially Dreissenid mussels, have affected the Great Lakes, but we still do need to do more research. For example, we have the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement from the 1970s that set phosphorus loading targets for all of the Great Lakes. Those targets are no longer applicable because the mussels have changed the way the lakes work. And right now, we really don't know what the optimal phosphorus loading targets are for all of the Great Lakes. We know that they'll probably be different than what they were. Lake Erie still needs to get lower in phosphorus, at least the Western Basin. But some of the other Great Lakes are well below the phosphorus targets that were set as part of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And so there's a lot of discussion now about what should the new phosphorus loading targets be for these systems in a way that can minimize the growth of nuisance algae in the nearshore zone while supporting this offshore fishery that's been suffering because of the Dreissenid mussels sucking all the plankton out of the water column. I hope I hit all your targets there, Marissa. I don't want to take up all the time that's left.
Thanks, Harvey. And Janice. And at some point, I want the panelists to think what we're gonna, after this question is done, after Janice comes Steve, and then I'm gonna ask all the panelists just for one sentence of what we can do to help international collaboration on Great Lakes stewardship with the current U.S. administration threatening to annex of Canada, right? So thinking of one thing we can do as a network to grow that collaboration and try to create more political empowerment around collaborations. Anyway, Janice, please.
Sure. So yeah, for the binational collaboration, there's the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative. It was formed in 2011 by the Great Lakes Commission, U.S. Geological Survey, and it's hosted in Michigan, and that's been phenomenal for sharing information across the Great Lakes, Phragmites information, and also to new research, any new information. It's kind of an information hub. They have great webinars as well. So that's been really wonderful to have. And also to the sharing of best management practice documents, whether we get them from from the States, or the States get them, we're sharing them, or other countries in the world that are dealing with the same invasive plant. It's very informative to be able to share these. Thinking of the Japanese knotweed, where you get a lot of information from the United Kingdom. And then also to new emerging threats like the flowering rush, what's popping up in some areas where they're controlling frags. So it's nice to be able to share that information. And also with science, like the research that's ongoing all the time, it's phenomenal to help inform how we improve things on the landscape, create that gap, filling that gap where we just keep doing same things over and over, and helping to inform how we do things better. I am really looking forward to the emerging technology with the multispectral imagery. I know they've come a long way with identifying, for instance, Phragmites. I think they're up to about 90% accuracy. If we can get that even tighter to 100, it'd be wonderful. And then you just send the spray drone out and it can just differentiate the invasive frag from the native frag and anything else and target that way. And also I mentioned the eDNA sampling. I think that's going to be as well a game changer for that early detection piece. So we can send the SWAT team out to get whatever really problematic invasive animal or plant is in a certain region and get rid of it before it is able to spread.
Thanks, Janice. And Steve.
Yes, I would say a lot of our work has really benefited from our interactions with our Canadian partners, especially those working on Lake Ontario, for universities and agencies both. Just because there's a lot of shared questions, but we come from it from a different perspective, and we've really been able to help each other further our research. You know, us and them have both benefited from these interactions. And then we've worked really closely my entire career with the various tribes and First Nations in Michigan, just because we've done a lot of work with commercial fisheries and lake whitefish issues, and those are very important issues to them. So having that local knowledge and that indigenous knowledge and that vested interest in these fisheries has really helped our research and to make that a very applied research questions towards addressing some of these issues.
Thanks, Steve. Now just one closing sentence from all of you, if you don't mind, about how what we can do to leverage good movement across the borders and anything else, but one sentence to pull it all together, if you don't mind. Sara.
Well, this is a tough one. I guess I'll take a line from my dad. Diversity of opinions and people is such an important contributor to understanding the best direction forward. And so keeping our two nations strong and information flowing as two discrete units, I think will maximize diversity of opinion and insight into tackling these problems.
Thank you so much. And Harvey.
I guess I would just say that I think in both Canada and the US, the Great Lakes tend to have support across the political spectrum. And we've seen that before here around Lake Michigan. And so that's encouraging. I think when it comes down to it, most people realize the economic and cultural resource that these systems are. So I would hope that the Great Lakes is one area where both within our countries and between our countries, we can find common ground. And for us as scientists and educators, I think our main task is to really let the public know how valuable these systems are, what the threats are to these systems, how much they've changed over the last half century, and what's needed to manage these systems. You know, my one concern is that, you know, the old adage, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And I think it's easy to underestimate how valuable the Great Lakes are. And it's our job to let both the general public and policymakers and politicians know how valuable these systems are.
Thanks, Harvey. And Janice.
Yeah, I think there's a really strong collaboration occurring, and I don't see, you know, the present political climate right now. I hope that doesn't change that. You know, uncomfortable when they're booing at the hockey game, the American national anthem. That's very for a lot of us. That, you know, keep the politics out of hockey, keep it under the science. You know, the Great Lakes are shared not only by our two nations, but also the First Nations communities, and I think, you know, we all recognize the importance of working together, regardless of what's happening in the political landscape.
Thank you. And Steve.
Yeah, I would just say real quickly that the Great Lakes are obviously a shared resource, and we've really benefited from working on them together binationally. And I think going forward, we would continue to benefit from that since it's worked so well in the past.
Thank you all. This has been very, very informative. I want to remind all of our attendees that this is a quarterly water symposium sponsored by the Freshwater Collaborative, the Great Lakes Higher Education Consortium, and the Council of the Great Lakes. You all will be receiving an email with a survey. We're going to have our next quarterly symposium in May, late May, early June. And so we want to get input on what you're interested in hearing about around the Great Lakes and within the Great Lakes. Thanks again to all of our panelists. Thank you for your time, your input, and your knowledge. We completely appreciate it. We hope you have a wonderful day.